Hello, welcome to the self-learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we are going to start Unit 1, Evolution of India's Worldview. First of all, introduction about the unit. The prime objective of this unit is to explain how India's history, culture, and philosophical tradition and ideas of freedom struggle helped the evolution of its worldview in the post-independence era. For after all, world view of any country being a form of social action and its makers being part of the social cultural milieu in which they operate, the significance of those values and traditions, especially those transmitted through successive generations, cannot be gainsaid. This is especially true in the case of countries like India, which has been the seat of an ancient civilization and meeting place of great cultures. According to India's first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, who tailored its worldview during the initial phase. Two aspects of India's worldview, namely the positive aspect of peace and the desire to promote a larger degree of cooperation among nations, were based on India's past thinking on the formulation of foreign policy. It is therefore necessary to discuss those socially accepted traditional values which are expressed either in writings of thinkers or embodied in ancient institutions and customs that inculcate peaceful attitudes and practices, notwithstanding imperfections or shortcomings in these ideas, an objective native to India. Now let us move to the point sources of traditional values. The chief sources of India's ancient values are the scriptures, texts like Vedas, the law book by sagas such as Manu, Yajnavalkya, and Parashar, the Dharma Shastra text of Buddhists and Jains, the great epics, the Ramayana and Mahabharata, the Puranas, legends, and chronicles of great national events, and theological treatises and manuals of worship. As a means of popular education in social values, these epics are even more important than the sculptures, texts, and law books, knowledge of which is generally confined to a very few. It is relevant to remember in this context that the above mentioned traditional sources of values covered various aspects of human life, such as spiritual, social, economic, and political. And ancient Indians did not divide human activities in watertight compartments. Secondly, though these traditional values underwent certain changes due to the impact of the Islamic and Western culture, the works of modern Indian thinkers like Vivekananda, Tagore, Tilak, Aurobindo, Gandhi, and Nehru show that they were very much influenced by ancient Indian thought, which in turn influenced their ideas about shaping the destiny of the independent India. Now, the next point nature of traditional values and themes in the evolution of worldview. Five aspects of India's traditional values have a bearing on the evolution of its worldview, namely preference for a middle way, tolerance, idealist and realist traditions, absence of imperialist tradition, and a habit of expressing positive ideas through negative terms. The first one is preference for the middle way. A preference for the middle way has been one of the cardinal features of Indian tradition and culture, as seen in the Sanskrit saying Alya Sarve Vigya, meaning let us eschew access at all times. This saying underlines India's philosophical abhorrence of absolute of extremes, of the tendency to see things strictly in terms of black and white. It runs like an unbroken thread through Indian culture. The Indian preference for the middle path is reflected in their attempt to synthesize the goals of dharma, duties, whether social, moral, spiritual, or ritual. Artha means capital accumulation. Kama means sensual pleasure. And moksha means liberation. Though dharma and moksha are given prime importance, artha and kama are not ignored. This is evident, for instance, from work like Vatyasana's Kam Sutra, from sculptures like those of Khajuraho, and other sayings like Sarva Guna Karta, all virtues lies in God. The Bhagavad Gita therefore speaks of the divine sanction for all desires, which are not against the moral order and moral law. While there may be disagreement as to how far the Indian have been able to translate their ideas into practice and to arrive at a position in the socio-economic and politico-religious ordering of life that could secure the solace of both the worlds, the here and thereafter. One cannot gainsay the significance of the underlying synergetic impulses of Indian culture. Michael Brecher therefore observes the central message of India's philosophical traditions dating from the Buddha has revolved around the rejection of absolutes and extreme positions. On the contrary, it has stressed philosophical relativity, intellectual catharsis, and coexistence of good and evil. In short, the golden middle path of compromises and tolerance of opposites. Nehru evokes the same sentiment when he says India has absorbed the harmonized different religions and even the conflict between science and religion in the past, and maybe it is our destiny to help reconcile the conflicting ideology of today. In view of such a cultural philosophical tradition, it was not surprising that India should prefer the golden means of the middle way between the two competing international ideologies during the Cold War years. Western liberal democracy and Soviet egalitarianism. With the West, India shared such values as dignity of individual and sanctity of civil liberties, democratic political institutions, the rule of law, and modern technology. At the same time, it appreciated the Soviet emphasis on distributive justice and its stand against colonialism and racism, as also its Asia mindedness. India therefore refused to align with any power bloc and resolved to cooperate with both of them in furtherance of its own ideals and interests. Nehru proclaimed this in a language reminiscent of the great Ashoka. Thus, we propose as far as possible to keep away from politics of groups aligned against one another. The world, in spite of its rivalries and hatred and inner conflicts, moves inevitably towards closer cooperation and the building up of a world commonwealth. This was the message of friendship that India issued in 1946. This policy of friendship gave India freedom of maneuver in a world which was getting frozen in its divisions. Even the great powers, their reservations notwithstanding, found India's detached strengths useful in the Korean, Indo-Chinese squares and other crises. Thus, by becoming a bridge between two power blocks and by blunting the edges of the ideological conflict between them, India acquired a prominence in the Committee of Nations far in excess of military strength and economic capabilities. The next one is tolerance. The aforesaid account of the ancient Indian philosophic attitude of avoiding extremes shows the traditional faith in reason and abhorrence of dogma. As the old Indian saying goes, Veda Veda Janti Tatusida, means enlightenment is achieved through debate. Ancient Indian tradition believes in the paramountcy of reasons. Prajna means reason is an important concept that indicates how one may pursue the three objectives of life: dharma, artha, and kama. In the Mahabharata, for instance, there is a clear attempt to relativize dharma by saying that it has to be judged on the basis of experience and reason. This undogmatic approach to duty and rational tradition that does not claim monopoly of truth constitutes the core of Indian culture. From it flows tolerance. This tolerance approach rests in the belief that the human mind, being limited in its range and power, cannot comprehend the nature of reality in its totality. The Rig Veda therefore proclaims Ekam Sadvripraha Bahuda Vadhanti, meaning the one truth is described variously by learned. The Upanishads declare that just as cows of varied colors yield the same white milk, all the different paths lead to the same goal. Tolerance is not just an ideal mentioned in the scriptures, it is a social reality. That is why, when the first Christian came to Kerala in 47 AD, they were not repulsed or hounded but welcomed. And when the first Jews came to Kerala in 70 AD, they too were welcomed and allowed to practice and propagate their faith. Similarly, when the Parsis fled their own country in the face of advent of Islam and came to India in the 7th century AD, they were also to practice and propagate their faith. The Ashokan edicts speak highly of tolerance of all the views then obtaining. Though there were religious preceptions during the time of some Muslim rulers. Tolerance was conspicuous during the reign of the Emperor Akbar, who adopted a policy of universal harmony. The Muslim poet Rahim and Hindu poet Tulsidas were close friends. The eldest son of Emperor Shah Jahan, Dare Sikho, translated the Upanishad into Parsis. The recurring caste and communal violence in India shows that there is much less tolerance today than there was in the past. We cannot deny that tradition of tolerance is fundamental to the life of the masses in India. This explains why secularism has been adopted and has survived in India in spite its aberrations. In the sphere of foreign relations, tradition of tolerance made it impossible for India to join any particular bloc and conduct its international relations from the black and white perspective of that bloc. The tolerance and pluralistic outlook of Indian mind made it to react instinctively against the politics of the Cold War, characterized by intolerance, and against the claims of two blocs that they alone had the monopoly of truth and virtue. Instead, India chose to pursue a policy of peaceful coexistence and friendship towards all countries. This is why, when in the 1950s, the then US Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and the then US Vice President Richard M. Nixon used almost abusive language with reference to the non aligned countries. Nehru urged them neither to suppress discussion nor to give up tolerance in discussing the external relations of the new countries. He said, I submit for consideration that Mr. Nixon and Mr. Dulles are saying something opposed to the democratic way of life. The very basic of democracy is tolerance for differing points of view. The tradition of tolerance, in fact, has been the basis of India's emphasis on peaceful settlement of disputes through negotiations. The essence of India's approach has been that to achieve a lasting result, an attempt should be made to see that neither of the parties engaged in a conflict suffers significant loss. This is how Gandhi tried to resolve India's domestic tension as well as to secure freedom for India. A modern application of the principle of negotiation so forcefully adumbrated in the Mahabharata. Nehru clarified the essence of this approach on several occasions. For instance, in a speech broadcast from London on 12th January 1951, he said, if we desire peace, we must develop the temper of peace and try to win over those who may suspicious of us or who think that they are against us. The aforesaid approach to negotiation was illustrated in India's Panchsheel agreement with China in 1954. The premium it put on the diplomatic negotiations for a settlement of the border dispute with China. Even after the situation worsened in 1959 and its acceptance of the Colombo proposals formulated by certain friendly countries after the Sino-Indian conflict of 1962 as the basis for the resolution of the India-China border disputes. Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee's visit to Beijing in June 2003 and the sincere attempts made by thereafter to move India-China relations forward is in line with India's traditional approach to negotiation. This approach to conciliation is also reflected in India's offer of a no war pact to Pakistan in 1949 and its repeated renewal of the offer in the subsequent years. Its willingness to accept a division of Kashmir on the basis of the ceasefire line in the interest of the Indo-Pakistani peace. New Delhi's current peace initiative with Pakistan is the latest manifestation of this negotiation method. Now we wind up today's lecture. Thank you so much for your attention.